Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
If the Palestinians had a royal family, our guest today, Dr. Ramzy Baroud, would be a member of it. One of the best-known writers and thinkers in the seemingly intractable conflict over a tiny piece of earth, smaller than a single park in South Africa.
He teaches from Santa Barbara to Malaysia. He writes from the Christian Science Monitor to Al-Ahram in Cairo. He's a former senior executive at Al Jazeera, and he took his PhD from England's famed Middle East department at Exeter University, where the eminent Professor Ilan Pappe, the Israeli historian, resides.
And yet, Dr. Ramzy Baroud has no piece of earth he can call his own, which may be why the latest of his 4 books is called The Last Earth, a Palestinian Story. I'm glad to welcome him on board the Sputnik. Dr. Ramzy, I've been an admirer of yours for a very long time. Am I right in my inference as to why the title of your latest book is The Last Earth?
That's correct. First of all, thank you for this lovely introduction and for having me. It's a great honor. Yes, absolutely. The story is that the story of all Palestinian refugees, and I'm a refugee. And for the last 70 years, we have been seeking a moment of respite, a safe place, a lost earth that we could call home. And it's the story of every character that I interviewed while writing the book. So yes, and sadly, they are yet to find that lost earth.
Give us your story. Where did your family come from? Where did they become refugees?
So my family came from this village called Beit Daras. It is somewhere south of Jaffa. And in 1948, this village had to fight 3 different battles with the Zionists and the British army at the time, and eventually they were conquered. They really fought with using the simplest of means. There were no warriors, and they were not did not receive any training of any kind. And eventually there was what we call the Great Beit Daras Massacre, when Beit Daras was vanquished and destroyed, and many people were killed, and the rest were on the run. And my family ended up being in Gaza. And I was born and raised in a refugee camp called the Nusayrat refugee camp until I was 22.
It's a story, of course, I've heard 10,000 times. The Palestinians, still in the middle of all this calvary, have produced brilliant intellectuals, PhDs by the thousands, maybe tens of thousands. You're one of those. You've become an eminent academic and writer. How do you go from the refugee camp in Gaza to teaching in Santa Barbara?
In fact, I'm not really the exception. In many of my friends and members of my generation, kind of took on the world, and they won in some sense. They were all empowered in their own ways, and they have succeeded in many ways. Many of them stayed, and many of them left as well. And I feel like we are still somehow connected to that original mission of our ancestors, but we are doing it in our own way. I think also my generation in particular was empowered by the first Palestinian Intifada, the uprising of 1987. And it's a statement that I often make, that Intifadas, uprisings, do not liberate land, they liberate people. It was during that period of time that I think my generation received that push, that collective sense of empowerment and it allowed us to imagine a world beyond the limits and the confines of the refugee camps and the way that we were perceived by the Israelis. I think that had a great deal of impact on our psyche, our collective psyche, as students in Gaza at the time and throughout all of Palestine. And eventually, many of them became leaders in the various resistance movements and intellectuals in many parts of the world.
I, by chance, was in Palestine when the first Intifada began, leading a parliamentary delegation. And when the incidents occurred, and suddenly, for the first time, we heard this word, Intifada. Maybe for the general viewer, you would explain what Intifada means and what it meant to you, and what you mean by liberating people rather than land. Clearly, the land has not been liberated.
Of course.
But a generation of people may well have been. Tell us the difference.
Absolutely. The term Intifada itself goes back to the early 20th century, when there were various uprisings against, at the time, against British colonialism, the British mandate in Palestine, and also against Zionist militancy that was growing rapidly and settlements throughout historic Palestine. I would say not until 1987 that the term Intifada became rather a universal term, that we don't even have to explain that Intifada means uprising for people to know what Intifada is. The reason that I'm saying that it liberated people, not land, first of all, I don't think the mission of the Intifada is to liberate land to begin with. But we go through these periods in which the Palestinian cause becomes rather hostage to the whims of Arab leaders and dictators. It gets ignored. Our leadership hasn't always made the best of decisions. Of course, as far as the United States and Israel are concerned, they would rather maintain the status quo, that of military occupation and apartheid and so on, forever and ever. It's usually during these moments when the Palestinian people are discounted entirely. It's when the Palestinian people rise. It's the moments where we feel as a collective we are at our lowest point. That's when people, they literally just go to the street expressing anger. And then they organize and they mobilize and they sustain their organization and mobilization for years. The first Intifada lasted for 7 years. It was compelled by its own power, its own energy. Very little support coming from outside. Very little by way of political programs coming from the Palestinian leadership abroad at the time in Tunisia. Most of this was done by the youth in refugee camps, operating under the harshest possible circumstances, facing death, injury, imprisonment, sieges, and so forth and so on. We had no social media at the time, no Twitter, no Facebook, yet we still communicated our messages using graffiti, at the decaying walls of the refugee camp, using all sorts of means to communicate, and yet somehow if a strike is declared in the Jabalia refugee camp under siege in Gaza, Palestinians in the northern West Bank would follow that strike. That's how much the power of the Palestinian people as a collective, independent from all of this, was at the time.
Now, you say that they would prefer to keep the status quo forever and ever. But in truth, if you go back to the beginning of this story, it was imagined that the Palestinians, what was that phrase, that the older amongst them will die and the younger will forget.
Yeah.
It was assumed that the Palestinian people would effectively eventually die. Arafat used to say, "We are not the Red Indians." It was politically incorrect, but we know what he meant. Yes. We're not going into the museum, he would say, of X people. Has it been surprising to your adversaries? Is it surprising in any way to you? What's special about the Palestinians that they did not end up in the museum already?
Yeah, because instead, what, there are 13 million now around the world? What is the number?
Right. Yes, yes.
13 million.
Yeah. And really that was the subject of my book. I embarked on this project to understand what makes us unique in a sense. Most refugees in various conflicts, once they leave their initial homeland, many of them integrate into societies and they kind of move on. If you go to Ain al-Hilwa, you'll find children in South Lebanon who can describe what their house in Palestine looked like, what their land, how much land, their determination to go back is still as strong after all these years, and we're talking about third and fourth generation Palestinians. So what is the key? Is it because we have such a savvy leadership? No, actually, we are the farthest away
Quite
from
the contrary.
that. Exactly. Is it because we have received this constant, decided support from our Arab brethren? Unfortunately, there's a lot of support amongst the people, but not from the regimes who, again, would share Israel's vision that they would like the whole thing to be sorted out at the expense of Palestinians. And the conclusion I came up with in the book is that there's this shared sense of resistance that you find among Palestinians, even if they ideologically disagree. The Christians and the Muslims those living under occupation and those living in exile, in Shatat, in diaspora, in Australia and in South America, there is this thing that brings us together as Palestinian and cements our relationship time and time again. And this is why during, for example, in the last war in 2014, thousands of Palestinians were killed in Gaza, and thousands more were injured, and much of the infrastructure of the Gaza Strip, as you know, was destroyed. And I would say that was perhaps one of those moments of unity that you found Palestinians in Santiago and Palestinians in Sydney and Palestinians in Jordan and Ain al-Hilwa and Jabalia had in common. Their admiration for the resistance, the fact, it's not that they were bewailing and decrying their victimization. To the contrary, is the fact that we can't fall. We have to stand still. We have to fight. So I think it's this, the key word has always been resistance for Palestinians. And the more they walk away from that, for example, the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, is the more that you find that the character of the Palestinian as a symbol of a larger Palestinian whole, that's when that character starts diminishing.
You just toured Canada, as have I many times. I've met the northernmost Palestinian refugee on the earth in a town called Yellowknife on the Arctic Circle at 47 degrees below zero. On the thick ice of the Great Slave Lake, they drilled a deep ice fishing hole for me. And as I approached the girl who was standing there with my rod and line, I could tell that she had an Arabic-looking face. I asked her, "Are you from Yellowknife?" She said, "I am from Jaffa." She was 11 years old, living in the Arctic Circle, but from Jaffa. Look, the second half beckons, but I need to take a break just now. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Sputnik. We're talking to Dr. Ramzy Baroud, author, teacher, thinker, intellectual from the Palestinian diaspora, former refugee from a camp in Gaza, now crossing the globe as someone who has to be read, who has to be listened to. Dr. Ramzy, earlier before the break, we were talking about the specialness of the Palestinians, how they haven't gone into the museum. And you posed a series of questions to yourself. Why? Is it because of our savvy political leadership, you asked? And we both tried not to laugh. I was very close to President Arafat for many decades. He was like a father to me. He made many mistakes. But what came after him has been smaller and smaller, is it not?
Of course, that's the case. And I think I disagreed with Yasser Arafat on a lot of things, but there is a difference between disagreeing over political strategies gone awry and having no respect whatsoever for your leader and feel that your leader is a tool in the hand of American imperialism, in fact, a tool in the hands of Israeli leaders as well. And I think this is what has befallen us since the passing of Yasser Arafat.
But how did that happen? You see, in the 1970s, when I became involved, early 1970s, halfway through 1975, the Palestinians were such a politicized people. How is it that they've ended up with a leadership that so few of them seem to represent?
Right.
How does that happen?
I think part of it is that the Palestinian leaders who are capable. It's not like we have a lack of intellectual minds and politically savvy minds and people who are grounded in Palestinian nationalism who are capable of leading this. I still think that the likes of Ahid Tamimi at 17 is perhaps not perhaps, I am pretty certain that she is more grounded than the entire Palestinian Authority.
Yeah.
And we have nearly 6,500 Palestinian prisoners. Many of them are educators and teachers and intellectuals and poets and artists. We do have that, but they are in prison. The best of our leaders are either in prison, assassinated, or in exile. The ones who are allowed to rule, especially since Oslo 25 or so years ago, they are ruling with an American and Israeli mandate. This is why we have the likes of Mahmoud Abbas aging at the expense of Palestinians, taking us to nowhere, wasting time instead of allowing a new generation to develop a real, clear Palestinian strategy that brings the people and their massive energies around the world together.
Now, in 1975, hardly anybody in Western countries supported the Palestinians, but everyone in the East did. This has reversed now. The Palestinian cause has mass support in the West, watching this program now, agreeing with every word you're saying. But in the East, the light often appears to have gone out.
The East and the South as well. And I think that there are two reasons for that. The anti-colonial movement was at its height in most of these places. You did not need to do any convincing when you went to speak in Cuba or various parts of South America or South Africa or Kenya, for example. You didn't need to go through what we have to go through in order for us to humanize the Palestinians and kind of try to explain the most basic elements of the Israeli, so-called Palestinian-Israeli conflict, because they are already sold. They are fighting the same fight. We felt that we are part of a global anti-colonial movement that was happening throughout the world. That has collapsed after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The left, sadly, has been in this constant process of rebranding itself as if it's ashamed of its own identity. And that's one of the reasons of why we lost a great deal of support among these people. But there is another important thing, and it's something that we as Palestinians deserve to be blamed for it. In the last 25, 30 years, before and during and after the Oslo Accords, we have been convinced that the new direction for the Palestinian struggle and the Palestinian cause is Madrid, Washington, London, and Oslo, and so forth. We abandoned that strategic depth that we took it for granted, unfortunately. And sadly, Netanyahu was on tour to Africa recently, borrowing from the Palestinian discourse, trying to appeal to African leaders. He was on another tour in South America as well. So here we are still knocking at Western capitals' doors while Netanyahu is going back to our turf and trying to galvanize support for Israel. A lot of work needs to be done on that front.
South Africa, of all countries.
Absolutely.
Which has gone through the same apartheid system. It should be an example, really.
But the beautiful thing about South Africa is that we have such a strong constituency in that country that it's actually drifting away from being anywhere near Israel. And hopefully soon that they will boycott Israel entirely, severe diplomatic ties with Israel. And that's because of the kind of strong base support that we have in that country. But we need to emulate that throughout the world.
It's a bit of an irresistible force meets immovable object, this. How can it be resolved? What's your path back? You don't want to look at Jaffa now, by the way. You wouldn't want to see Jaffa now. I've been there. How do you get back to your family home?
The real problem for Israel has been not our leadership as we agreed, and not the lack of the political will from the US and its allies to impose a solution, if you will, on the Palestinians, but rather the strength of the Palestinian people. We are going through a cultural war with Israel. The fact is their will have, at the end of the day, as has been the case for many years, two nations, two people living on that piece of land. But they are living under different rules. One is treated with superior status as first-class citizens, and the others have to contend with these racist apartheid rules. The Palestinians in today's Israel, what we call Palestine 48, are living under different rules than those in the West Bank, Area A and B and C. As you know, the West Bank itself is divided. Gaza is completely besieged. Jerusalem is annexed. But at the end of the day...
And that's before we talk about the girl in Yellowknife and the boy in Rio de Janeiro.
That's right.
There's 13 million Palestinians, all of whom have legal and moral right to return.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Israel understands this well. They understand it very well to the extent that they are passing, and in fact passed decisions and legislations at the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, that prohibits Palestinians from remembering their catastrophes. It is illegal to commemorate the Nakba by Palestinians living as citizens of Israel. It is even the names of Arab streets are being changed to Hebrew names. As of late, there was this so-called controversy on Virgin Atlantic, where the Zionists made a big deal over the fact that there was an item on the menu that says Palestinian-inspired couscous salad. They found that to be, in some strange sense, an act of anti-Semitism, and Virgin Atlantic removed that item. What does this tell us? Israel is afraid of our culture, afraid of our people as a people. They're trying to break any sense that we exist as a nation. They understand that this is their most decisive battle. We're not going anywhere. We will continue to fight, and I think this is why I find the debate of one state, two states is rather stifling. It is, of course, a one state. It has always been a one state. It's just there's a group that is advantaged, another that is discriminated against, and we need to change these rules altogether.
Of course, as you, I think, implicitly acknowledged earlier, the Israelis who were born on that land have thus acquired national rights. The idea of, you know, they should go home to where their grandparents were driven out of or left is fanciful. So some solution has to be found in a very small piece of land for, if you put the two of them together, quite a significant number of people. How would that work?
First of all...
You do call it a one-state solution, no?
Yes. It's just the word solution that bothers me a little bit.
It's not a solution, no.
Because it's, again, I mean, we start defining what is a just solution and so forth. And as far as Israel is concerned, I don't think it's the lack of genius solutions. I don't think Netanyahu is waiting in his office for Ramzy to tell him through television that the solution is this, and he's going to bang his head on the table and say, brilliant, this is the solution, let's do this. They know exactly what the solution is. The solution to apartheid is anti-apartheid, ending apartheid. The solution to occupation is ending occupation. That's the solution. But as far as how do we coexist in that piece of land, the fact is, for centuries, in fact, for more than centuries, and this is not being said out of any ethnocentric feelings or anything, many invaders came and went. And many of them, not just in Palestine, but in the larger Arab world, and many of them were absorbed into that culture. We have that kind of culture. In fact, Palestine is a mosaic of cultures. Yes, we are an ancient people. Jericho has been around for, what, 15,000 years? Yet the invaders come and go, intermarry, stay, leave, and so forth. And the Palestinians, as a people, as a nation, as a whole, they always stay. Can we actually find a formula that would make that work? I think so. For 500 years, the Jews who escaped Spain found refuge. After 1492, when the Crusaders kicked them out, along with the Muslims, found refuge in North Africa and eventually in Palestine. So historically, it does make perfect sense that we are capable, in fact, of coexisting. We just can't coexist with Zionism and racism.
God willing, I'll see you in another 10 years and we'll discuss this further. Dr. Ramzy Baroud, thanks for joining us. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
So following Donald Trump's recent recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, what is next for Palestine? Nadia Al-Alusi says, rapidly, though gradually, Palestinian people will be beyond their own land borders. And Ramadan Adrabu says, the Palestinian people will never surrender. They will keep fighting until Palestine, the whole Palestine, from the sea to the river, is free again. Eventually, dogs will go away.
Well, you know, I don't see it that way. The Israeli people are not dogs. They're not going to go away. Some would not like to live in a Palestine-Israel of equals. And some Palestinians abroad would not like to go back to a Palestine-Israel of equals. But I think Dr. Ramzy's point of view was that eventually, because this has to be worked out, that it will be
because it has historically been the case like that. Well, okay, that's all the time we've got for the tweets
Which,
today.
alas, means that's the end of the show.
But you can stay in touch with us on social media, on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today, or on Twitter and Instagram, RT_Sputnik. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.